Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming. Hello. I appreciate greatly your faith in coming to the talk without a description. So presumably you found the title alone interesting, and I appreciate that. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'd like to cover, and you can decide if this is the description you came for or not. This is primarily a non-technical presentation. So this is not a presentation where I am going to show you the secret ZCML code to use adapters to build your intranet. If you would like that, please go pester Martin in the hallway. This is a class mostly about building straightforward, using Plon's built-in tools to the range of using add-on products, common tips and tricks, and some sort of old tales about what you might pay for training, what you might pay for deployment, what you might expect in terms of servers, kind of the business numbers for a few different size intranets. I will show off a handful of techniques, and I'll talk about workflows that have worked and business processes that have worked and such. So that's what I'd like to cover. Paul Uni, is this microphone loud enough that you can hear me? Thank you. So what I'll talk about in this order then is some tricks about and some lessons about when you create content in Plon for intranets. What are the features, especially the features for Plon 3 that may not be obvious, that may benefit primarily intranet type settings? I'll talk about the kinds of classic content management snafus that happen on intranets. Since the content isn't public, it's just for the company, things can linger in private states forever and such. And how can we make the workflow work for us? How can we find out what things are lingering in those kind of states? I'll talk about, in a handful of domain areas like bug tracking systems or wiki systems or such, what seem like the widely used current add-on products in the intranet space. I'll talk about some theming tips that primarily are for internal sites as well as sites that have some divergence by department. The finance department wants a slightly different look than the administrative department. And then I'll talk about, as promised, the what might you expect in terms of server costs and how many servers might you have for 100 logged in users, 500 logged in users, things like that. I'll also talk about, from my experience as a trainer, how much time might you budget for you to teach your users how to add content to Plon versus manage content in Plon versus build Plon sites. We have about 40 minutes together, so I'm not going to do too much talking. Hopefully, there'll be lots of time for questions. Is that a laugh? No, really, there'll be time for questions, I promise. I can't talk all the time. The things that make intranets feel different and the things that we'll want to talk about and really focus on that you'll want to think about if you're a consultant building an intranet. Right out of the box, there's a huge percentage of logged in users, and that has significant ramifications for caching. Everything you know about Plon's performance, you have to throw out for intranets, because what it's going to feel like performance-wise is going to be radically different. Public magazine sites I build have 50, 60, 100,000 visitors and 10 people who edit content. That's a dramatically different performance perspective than an organization with only 200 visitors, 100 of which are editing content. So the first thing you really want to think about is that difference in perspective ratio. Large number of those contributors, you have to teach them, and you have to clean up their mistakes. You're going to have typically a lot more structured content types. A lot of public Plon sites will survive with the Plon page, the Plon news item, a handful of specialized types like wiki pages. A lot of intranets tend to have much more the grant applications, the sick day requests, the small applications masquerading as customized archetypes. So you'll have to budget more time to build those kind of content types. You will typically, though not always, and hopefully, have simpler, more trusting workflows if you have workflow really at all for your intranet. And I'll show you some workflows that I've used in the past. And you'll often have the same content being deployed for multiple purposes, for printed out use in meetings, for showing on screens and such. The challenges we're going to have, and I do some consulting on intranets, and I always am introduced to the most junior, youngest person in the IT department because they are in charge of the intranet. It is the job that practically no one signs up for in IT. You're the last to arrive. Hi, you're the director of our intranet. It's typically under-resourced in terms of servers. It's just our intranet, so we'll take the Celeron out of our closet and run things on it. Where our public site, we're going to buy 5 blades for or such. But again, people aren't thinking about that weighting difference in logged in versus non-logged in users. And as a lot of us know, they're often undervalued, where the senior staff person who writes the check for the intranet won't ever actually log into it to add content or look at content. So how can you enforce that with training? How can you enforce that with expectations? Some of the stories we'll hear about what people want from their intranet. We want shared space for files. We want some way for communication, message boards, commenting system, things like that. We want an easy way to build those kind of light-weighty applications, vacation requests, those kind of things. And often, what a lot of us would think about is sort of an extranet. We want some place we can create the press releases, product announcements, things like that, that ultimately might migrate to the real site. Talk first about a handful of tips and tricks that are built into Plone for adding content that often benefit intranets. We have, and I've got a fairly uncustomized Plone site here. Plone 3 introduces the presentation mode. A lot of you have tried that link, and I find in my classes a lot of people have never clicked that link. Presentation mode gives you a slide screen presentation of your content. Very useful in encouraging those senior staff people to put their content into their intranet, because then they get the PowerPoint presentation for free. I know, but turn it around and it becomes an advantage for them. So you can get more use from your intranet that way. You don't have to call it PowerPoint if you can't bring yourself to say that. The table of, as we all know, the table of contents feature, again, a slightly hidden thing in Plone 3 for pages and other types of content like pages, newly added and somewhat hidden in Plone 3, table of contents, which will give us, and I may have to refresh here to see that because I've got a little bit of caching going on. Gosh, never do live presentations. Well, what you can see if you squint really carefully and use your imagination is the table of contents box that appears at the top right of a page. I'm not sure what's going on there. That's a very solid working feature in Plone 3. But it's a useful feature for helping the people with large things like HR manuals, policy statements, things where their first impulse is, can't I just upload my Word document? Sure you can, but look at this nice feature you'll get if you turn it into HTML. You'll get this nifty little linked table of contents, and it stays up to date for you. So again, trying to sort of push the spectrum for getting the staff that you really need to contribute content to contribute content. We also have, in the last of the you may not have noticed features in Plone 3, the previous next feature for folders. I'll pop into here to a folder that has lots of content, such as one of these project folders. And if you've never noticed this on the folder content type in Plone, we have enable next previous navigation. When you use that and you look at a piece of content in the folder, anything at all, you'll get for free the rather typical, and again, helping push those HR managers, policy managers, people who are writing the long documents, why look, you get all this nifty kind of book-like right out of the box navigation. So it'll scroll them through all the pieces of content in that folder. One of the core things that, and a lot of the intranets I've worked on, they'll have dozens or hundreds of these, are collections, what in Plone 3 we call smart folders from Plone 2.5. I usually walk through with my clients about a 10% rule, not Gare's 10% rule, which is a great 10% rule, but I expect that about 10% of your staff who contribute content should be able to build collections. That's the sort of sweet spot for me of, if it's too much more than that, you may be wasting time teaching a difficult skill to too many non-technical users. If it's too much smaller than that, like it's just you and 2 other people, you may be doing too much work yourself in terms of report writing. Now, building collections is not a trivial thing. It takes me about 3 hours, 4 hours to teach it in a class. There are a lot of things you can do there. So you want to pick the right 10%, obviously. And I also find is very helpful is the idea of having a template folder, a folder that contains sort of meta smart folders or meta collections, and teaching people to come and copy those. You don't have to ever build a smart folder, a collection from scratch. Here's a folder that contains 20 sample ones. Teach them how to copy that, teach them how to tweak it. I find that to be much more successful. I also tend to encourage people to ship written reports that show the collection in ways more sophisticated or more different than the collection view, the tabular view, the summary view, the kind of generic views that ship with collections. Mostly so people will continue to use collections and not break out and do everything as a one-off kind of template script. You can start off with the standard Plone views, which you get normally for all collections. I'm looking here at a folder. Let me pop into a collection. We'll see the same thing. You can also, whoops. And let me just pop in and go into the collection itself. You can also add your own things to this menu. You can see here I have these two new reports, view with full details, view as content report. A lot of people think about putting additional templates in for other content types, not for collections, smart folders. I think when you can have 4 or 5 or 6 things that are more specialized for your client here, again, you're more likely to get your clients to try to solve their problem with collections versus trying to solve things as one-offs. Once I have those collections that are useful, intranets really shine with the 3.0 feature of dashboards. For those of you that haven't seen the dashboard, I'm not going to talk much about it because I don't want to go too much off track here, but the dashboard is the ability for any logged in user to put their own portlets for their own purposes, kind of a my.plone.org sort of metaphor. And so here's a dashboard I made for myself. For those of you that haven't seen it, the dashboard is basically a place to put portlets. And one of the greatest portlets we ship with in Plone 3.1 is a portlet that lets me tie to any collection that's already written. So I don't have to build new portlets. I certainly don't want to teach my users how to build new portlets. But I can teach that 10% or even 20 or 30% once someone has written that smart folder, written that collection. Here's how you can get it on your screen of stuff, that dashboard of theirs. And I have here examples of pretty typical collections that I'll encourage clients to create and share. Things like the recently added items that comes free with Plone, things that had been created more than a week, more than a month ago, have been submitted into a pending state and never been approved. That's usually not because the reviewers are actively discussing it and thinking about it. That's usually because they've forgotten about it and assume someone else will handle it. So making a hotspot for you of what's likely to be overdue for review. Even more critical, what content has been created more than a day, a week, a month ago, and is still in a private or draft state. Again, 99% of the time, that means the user simply forgot to submit it. So building those kind of useful administrative content management focused, especially for intranets where we tend to have a lot more content, and getting it so that users, especially your administrative users, can put that on their dashboard. In terms of the other content management simplifications, make things easier for your users, I talk a lot about in the Humane CMS talk, which I've given at previous Plone conferences, that one of the spikiest, trickiest things about Plone tends to be the default pages. For those of you who don't know, the default page is the ability to walk up to any folder, pick any piece of content, and make that piece of content act like the default piece of content for the folder, such that when you go to the folder /chemistry, you'll actually see the about the chemistry department piece of content. It's a really neat thing. It solves a super common request. We want a splash page for the folder, but it introduces a lot of complexity for users. If you watch your users use your site, you'll see things like them clicking the edit tab to edit the folder and be confused about why they're editing the page, or vice versa. Publishing one, not publishing the other, hiding one, not hiding the other, commenting on one, not commenting on the other. Users just don't ever understand that idea that the folder and the page are separate. Especially for intranets, again, where I have more users and often less sophisticated users creating the bulk of my content, I really focus on if they want a folder with a rich body field, if that's their goal, just give it to them. Make an archetype that's folderish, give it a body field. I usually call that a section myself so it doesn't collide too much with folder, and that's what most users add. They put something in the body field, they see what's in the body field. They also see what's in the folder listing at the bottom. They leave the body field blank, it looks just like an ordinary folder. So it removes 98% of the cases for default pages while reducing a huge amount of spiky complexity, especially for intranets. One of the moving a little beyond editing into management pieces that I've used a lot with Plone 3 on intranets are the content rules. And I'll do a little quiz here because I think a lot of people don't use them quite yet. How many of you use content rules on your Plone 3 site? How many of you have a Plone 3 site and either don't know what one is or know and don't use them? That's the majority of us. I think the content rules are the best thing about Plone 3, hands down. They're a really neat idea. It's just so generic, it's hard to appreciate how cool it is. Content rules are a machine for saying, when X happens, do Y. You get to manage X, you get to manage Y, and then you get to forget about it and let your staff take care of turning it on, turning it off, moving it around, changing the stuff. Classic examples: when content gets submitted, send email. When content gets created, email someone who might help. When deletions happen, log that in a file, things like that. Content rules are a built-in feature for Plone 3, and I think they're a really solid, nice feature. You'll find them under Site Setup, down under Content Rules. I've created one or two already. You can certainly learn how to create them in one of the Using Plone books. But I've created one. It takes about 3 minutes, such that when email is submitted, when content is created, email is sent out. That's a classic one. I also have one that's a slightly different way of thinking about what content rules are good for, which is more of a help feature. When content is added, you'll get a message that reminds you that you have to submit it for publication. This is not, I think, what content rules were invented for, but it's a nice way of leveraging the same machinery to give the user some help right in their browser. We'll take a look at that one. So I, as a user, will come in. I'm going to pop in here, look under the rules. In this folder, I'll say, within this section of our site, we want to remind people to submit. That's now turned on, and I will come and add some content. Warning, your content isn't visible until approved. Please submit it when you're ready. And though you can't see it here, I also sent an email to the user with that. You can get a bit fancier and put checks in your content rule to say things like, is this a newish user? Is this the first time they've created content? There's a lot of research about how humans learn that says don't try to teach them too much. Wait until they need to know it to teach it. And so one very smart thing to do would be just mention the idea when you're teaching them how to add content about workflow. It might be 4 months until they add content. In a lot of organizations, when you get training and when you need training are really separate. When they first add content, that's the email they can shoot out that says, great, thank you for adding your first thing to our website. Now, here's how you can submit it for publication when you're ready. But I use that, that's the notification action in content rules, to provide some help when something happens. One piece to know about the content rules, one of the most classic things you'll want to do is send email. They can send email out of the box. The system for sending email is rather weak, I think intentionally so. It's meant to be very simple. However, a lot of you want to do things like, can we send email to the person who wrote it, as well as to everyone else in their work group? Can I send email with the title of the email being the title of the piece of content they submitted? Those kind of conditional and evaluative sort of expressions. There's an add-on product called collective.contentrules.mail that provides a much, much more sophisticated email sender with lots of variable replacements. And if you're using content rules to send mail, you'll want to check that out, because you probably have already noticed how simple but limited the email sending built-in is. Moving on to the workflow and approval end of things, a piece that a lot of you will have noticed and a lot of you may not have noticed about Plone 3, and this bites a lot on intranets, is that files and images in Plone 3 no longer use workflow. You add a file, it's neither published nor unpublished. It simply has the status and security of the folder that it's in. Images are neither published nor unpublished. They have the status and security of the folder they're in. This was primarily because we found from user testing that nobody ever bothered to publish images or files. And on Plone 2, given that our default was to be in a public draft state, effectively it never really hurt them. In Plone 3, where the default state is private, all of a sudden the behavior that used to work, i.e. not remembering to publish the images, didn't work. People had broken links, they had broken images, and so on. The challenge I often find is that on public sites, images and files will often be public assets, photos of buildings, shiny, happy pictures of board members, things like that. On intranets, it tends to be often internal project assets. And so people may have gotten used to the idea of images are safe, I can just add them, and then all of a sudden they're adding in salary documents that are PDFs, and they have no workflow. You don't add salary documents to your public site, so a lot of people have learned or intuited from Plone, don't worry about it for files and images. You might want to revisit that case for your intranet. It's very easy to turn on and choose what workflow you'll use for files and images. I have in my materials here some drawings of the common Plone workflows, and then I'll talk about one or two that I especially recommend. For those of you not yet using Plone 3, this is the new standard workflow for Plone 3 called the simple publication workflow. Things start off as private. There is no more public draft. They go to a pending state. They go to a published state. In Plone 3 out of the box, almost everyone has to submit their content. However, Plone 3 now, with this simple publication workflow, doesn't have what I used to call the CNN case. The CNN case was the case of you create a news story, you're a journalist for CNN.com, you hate your job. So your news story, you title something like, G8 summit ends successfully, blah, 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 boring, blah, blah, blah. You give it to your boss publishes it. It's the homepage of CNN.com. Then you edit that story to say what? I hate my job, I quit. And your resignation letter is the most important story in the world. That's the CNN case. Plone 2 did not allow people to publish content, to edit content once it was published. You had to retract it, you had to resubmit it for approval, it had to get reapproved. Plone 3 does allow that. And I think in almost all cases on intranets, you will want people to edit content. 99 times they're editing content, they're fixing typos, they're fixing phone numbers. If you make users retract, get approval to fix a phone number, what are they going to do? Not fix the phone number. There's that little cue that says, meh, it takes about 2 minutes too long, somebody else will fix that phone number. So for a public site where you have often this very staffed, very head in the noose kind of group creating the public site, you can have those kind of pushing the blame problems and survive it. For intranets, I find that you need to be really savvy about anything that creates more of a burden for people to edit content, because you're really distributing that editing, and the bar of responsibility people feel individually is often much, much lower. Plone 3 ships with the Plone 2 logo, so if you liked it back then, you'll love it now. I think that most of us found that a not very useful out-of-the-box workflow. This is the one where things started off in a drafty state, where things were public, and we had the CNN case. That hasn't changed since Plone 2. Plone 3 also ships with an intranet-extranet workflow. It sounds promising, and I think it has some good ideas, but I don't find that most intranets or extranets use it. Things start off in a draft state where they're visible. So we're back to that, the moment you create it before you even clean up your own mistakes, people can immediately see it. Things get published either internally or externally, there's a hidden state. I think the problem that bites most people is that things are immediately visible, and it still has that CNN case of you have to retract things, reapprove them, republish them. So some good ideas in terms of the internally published, externally published, but for most of us still not really hitting the sweet spot for intranets. Not a very common case. Yeah, Alex?
Will you file a bug on this?
Will I file a bug on this? I'm filing a bug in front of a live studio audience. Sure. We also ship some workflows that are folder specific. In other words, workflows where we expect you to act differently for folders than you act for content. Pages have this approval process. Folders could have this approval process. And I found, again, where you distribute responsibility for editing, their ability to absorb complexity and difference is smaller, and that people just don't understand why their choices are different for a folderish thing than for a non-folderish thing. It may go back to the same kind of confusion about default pages, that fundamentally a lot of your users just don't really understand what a folder is. To them, it's just another piece of content they're putting in their site. So I myself tend not to use, and I tend to discourage the use of different workflows for folderish things than you have for the non-folderish page, news item, book, grant application, things like that kind of content. The more technical challenge is that if you do use default pages, or if you don't use default pages even, but you have different workflows for folders and documents, it's hard to keep things in sync. You may not have the same names for things. You may have it be called visible here and published here, and if you write scripts that try to publish everything, it won't succeed with folders. So I find that you'd have to work hard to give them exactly the same names so that they work the same anyway. We do ship those. I don't use them. We ship both a community folder, that's kind of the Plone2 workflow, but for folders, and then we ship a very small and I think somewhat strange intranet folder workflow where things are either draft or private and never published. I've never quite understood that one. I would say start off with the question, do you want workflow? And I jokingly talk about in class Joel's rule of reviewer attention, which is the quality that you actually get from a reviewer is equal to the equation 1 divided by 2 to the power of how many things they have to review a day. And for those of you who aren't good at math, that number gets really small really quickly. You give someone 3 things a day to review, they might pay attention. You give them 5 things a day, they just look. You give them 10 things a day, and they become what I euphemistically call a click monkey. Think back to like Psych 101, those little monkeys that are given cocaine and just push the little bar 10,000 times a second. That's what they become. So ironically, though you may have wanted more control, you actually get less quality. You have less control because the people that you think should be doing something useful are just saying, I don't know why, but every time I log in, I'm supposed to click my mouse button 14 times on this button marked approve. So you really lose it fast. Your job is to reduce the number of things people need to review. I think this is a somewhat immovable law. I think that either you have to get more reviewers if you really need more reviewing, or you have to have less things that need review. I don't know that there's really much you can do to actually get people to pay attention to more than 5 or 10 things tops. Therefore, Plone ships with a really great workflow called the one-state workflow. Things start off as published, and they stay published. You may not be able to use this. However, it is useful, and it's often better than not using security at all, because from a technical perspective, it gives us an easy way to make changes to the security settings across the site without having to go onto a bunch of different objects to make those changes, because we can make that change in the single workflow policy. So before you use no workflow, you should talk to someone, read a book, go online, and ask about what are the sort of technical differences between no workflow and an always published single workflow state. I myself tend to use workflows like this on a lot of sites. Things start off in a private state. No one can see them. They can submit them, but that's not submitting for approval. It's asking for help. And I change the labels to say things like ask for help. Most users, most of the time, can publish things themselves. The person who submits the news item for everyone's birthday has done this 100 times before, and she's going to get it right. Or you can always go back and hide it. However, she's going to ask for help when she does something new, something unusual, something where she might actually need some help. What does this mean for the reviewers? They have far less stuff to review, and more importantly, they know that someone actually cares about their putting some quality in the process. Someone asked them for help, which is way different than being some little cog in some process that everything has to flow through them. So I encourage a workflow where you try to shift the sort of mental paradigm from I seek your approval, you give it, you don't, to I ask you for help, you move it along or you don't. I gave a presentation and talked about workflow a few years ago for an organization that was building a very large public and private site, and they unrolled the workflow diagram they wanted us to build. And it was like, roll, 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 18 boxes, every single person that worked for this government agency. And there was another government agency that had been using Plone in the room that had really been happy, loved Plone, had a great site. And the first agency is unrolling their workflow and saying, well, your workflow, your site's so great. Your workflow must be way more complex than ours, right? And the second group said, no, in fact, we don't use workflow at all. Oh my God, how can you not use workflow? Well, we simply put at the bottom of every page the name of the person who last edited it and their internal phone number within the organization. And if you want to embarrass your boss in public, that's up to you. And we've never had a problem. I can't promise you that works. I'm just reminding you that you have bigger sticks than workflow in the world to keep bad things from happening. Firing, something we don't have an event handler for, firing is a very powerful event. What time does my presentation end, Alex? What time does this end, please? Okay, so we don't have much time for questions. Let me talk for another moment or two about some basic things. I will have time for some questions or two, and then I'll have time for questions during the break if you want to grab them. I often ship this workflow for the intranet, extranet problem. I find the person who created the content themselves usually is the right person to decide, is this going to be an internal for staff or external to the world person? Again, think about this not so much as security, but about getting help. They're the expert about their content, not some person in another department who just approves things. So they can either publish it or publish it. They can get help if they want. They can get help if they want. But when they get help, they're signifying to the reviewer, I need help. This is going to be a public thing on the website. This is going to be a private thing for our company. The challenges you have, people forget to submit content. We talked about a content rule that can remind you of that. You can also build that collection that will remind you what kinds of things have not been submitted. Things don't get reviewed on time. You can use the content rule to email the reviewers. You can also build the kind of collection we looked at. People don't understand and can't visualize the workflow. There's a developer-facing product called DC Workflow Graph. It's mostly for developers, but it has one brilliant feature, which is it draws your workflow live graphically. It's meant to be used in the ZMI for developers who are building workflow, but you can simply take that graphic and put that graphic in the help section of your site. So you can get free, and you can even have them be automatically generated drawings of your live workflow in the documentation to show your users, here's how things get approved. And I've sometimes gone the extra step and made little buttons that say, show me the approval process for this document, and they'll see that graphic showing what the workflow would look like given the kind of content they're working on. Don't want to go much into it. I just want you to know what it's called. There's a product called Placeful Workflow, which if you have the one outlying department, the finance department is paranoid, you don't have to drag the rest of the organization down with them. Placeful Workflow lets you have a different mapping of workflow policies placefully in your site. So for this group, they have paranoid policies. For the rest of the site, we don't. Steve McMahon, I can see in back, the primary author and maintainer of Plone FormGen, which is the total solution in 90% of the cases for the bread and butter problem a lot of internets have, which is the everyday sick form, vacation form, feedback form, are you coming to the training form, things like that. That allows you to get those results as email. That allows you to get those results as a spreadsheet. And if you want to have a really pretty form that end users can maintain, and have it create content like archetypes content or other kinds of Plone content, there are recipes on plone.org for doing that. The nice thing about Plone FormGen is you can build half of it and hand it to your users for maintenance. They can copy a working form and tweak it slightly, and you'll never get requests for things like, can you go back and make this field required? Can you change the description of this field? It's brilliant, even if that's the only part your users do. It's a really rock solid product. Other products that get used a lot in the internet space, at least by me, Poi I tend to use as a bug tracking system used in the Software Center on plone.org. It's intended for software. I'll use it a lot for request type things, lightweight project tracking. Plone.content ratings, which gives us the kind of 1 to 5, how much did you like this content, how useful was this content, a sort of Likert-style content rating. That for me is the currently contemporary best of the content rating products. And the areas where I struggle, and you may struggle as well, finding a supported, currently maintained, easy to use product, calendaring and shared events, which we're having a sprint on, I'm sure, because we always have a sprint on it, but it's somewhat of a weak area for us still. Getting the ability to store lots and lots of large Word documents, large PDFs, things like that, it's still a challenge in terms of performance for a lot of sites. If you want to do that, try it out, plan it, write some scripts to test what that will feel like. And wikis. We have 2 good wiki products, one called ZWiki, which is a very, very full-featured wiki. It was very well maintained for about 6 years, and the maintainer just said about a year ago, I'm really backing away from the product a bit. And then we have Wicked, which is some technology that ships inside of Plone, but is also sort of at this point a somewhat incomplete, somewhat not well-maintained product. So wikis tend to be, for a lot of organizations, a weakish area. For theming, sometimes, you may giggle, sometimes you can get away with less design for your intranet. Sometimes. But almost always you should try. Because if there's any area where you're going to install the kind of add-on products to give you the extra buttons, the tabs, the extra UI components, things like that, it's going to be for your intranet. And you're going to want to make sure that you have all the standard viewlet managers that Plone assumes you have, that you have all the standard site actions and such that Plone assumes you have, because those add-on products are going to try to leverage those slots and spaces and tabs much more than you're likely to add new add-on products to a public site 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years after deployment. I find that most intranets just grow feature-wise faster and therefore benefit more from a look and feel that is closer to ours, so you have less editing to do of custom products. I do give you, for those of you that don't know, the tip on how to have minor style divergence on your site. There's a CSS trick, it's well documented, but you may not have seen it, that if you're inside the chemistry folder, we magically inject a little class, a CSS class, onto every body tag we generate inside that section of your site, and you can change the color there, or change anything about the CSS in your CSS. For example, I use that trick here, if you keep your eyes on the left-hand portlet box. As I move around the sections of my site, I can change for the kinds of simple things departments often want. Can we just have the banner color and the logo and such be different for the different departments? There's also a nice product called CSS Manager, which has the goal of being a much easier, big, broad knob for simple theming, and I think it succeeds brilliantly at that. It is moving to, and in addition has the promise of being super useful for the slight differences per department, because it will allow the per departments to make those kind of choices. We want the red background, we want the slightly different footer color on a per department basis through an attractive UI, not through your having to maintain group CSS. It's not quite there, but that's on the list for the current maintainers of it, so you may want to give them some props in that direction. I'm going to break here in about 2 minutes. Let me just talk about 1 or 2 last things, which is to point you out what else I can talk about in my handouts or answer questions about. I have some advice on single sign-on, both the definition of single sign-on, which is basically just you have the same password in 2 places, and the products that are currently used for that, versus you want to have actual single sign-on and have something like Apache handle doing the authentication and passing that down to Plone. And I give you some links to what are the current products for those. I talk about migration, and I give you some advice on what the expected setups for sites that I've built in the past are. So for a site that has about 100 users, not concurrent users, here's the kind of hardware, the kind of setup we got away with, versus for about 500, versus for quite a large internet I worked on this year, there was about 5,000 users a day. What kind of setup did we have? About how much would that hardware cost you if you ran across the street to buy it? I apologize, I actually am at time, so I will break here to take 1 question or 2 questions. I'll be happy to take questions after the break, and then you can grab me in the hallway or such. So I do have my entire materials online, and they are all at plonebootcamps.com/resources. There's a PDF of this handout called Real World Intranets. My name is Joel Burton. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. And if you've got a question, just come and grab me here, and I'll try to walk with you. Thanks a lot. As you can see, I'm clearly used to 8-hour classes, not 40-minute presentations, so I brought a little bit too much material, but if you have questions, come and grab me. Thanks. Typically, people have the idea they want to use. They have no preference or idea about what they want to use. Now, I'm not